Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, as is our custom, let's go around the room and introduce ourselves, to say our name. If you could take a little time in between so it's not too much like a roll call, that'd be great. If I may all begin. My name is Roy.
My name is Jim Bucher.
Paul.
I'm Carl Wolf.
My name is John Wessel.
I'm Jerry Martin.
I'm Peter.
Baruch.
I'm George.
My name is Ray Dyer.
Warren. Marty.
My name is Clint.
Leor.
Marty Collins.
My name is Oswaldo.
I'm Anthony.
My name is Fred.
My name is Bruce.
My name is John.
My name is Glenn.
I'm Jack.
My name is Tom.
I'm Mark.
I'm Lee Robbins.
Peter.
I'm Jerry Jones.
Anthony.
James.
Brian. I'm Richard Schleimer.
My name is Michael.
Jay Davidson.
My name is Joe.
And Jim Stewart.
I'm Richard Assolini.
My name is Mark.
Is that everyone?
I'm Sean.
And Sean.
Yeah.
Yes. Our speaker today is Sean Feit. Sean has practiced meditation in the Rinzai Zen and Theravadan Buddhist traditions since 1993 and yoga since 1995. He studies meditation and mindfulness with Jack Kornfield, Sylvia Borstein, and Eugene Cash, yoga with David Moreno and Alice Jonu, and piano with Myra Melfort. He was a monk in Burma in 2002 and maintains a regular intensive retreat practice. His yoga teaching emphasizes breath and concentration in asana, focusing on alignment and devotion. Sean is also a member of the performance company Circle Zero and teaches piano to adults. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks, all of you. It's a pleasure to be back here. I feel a little sick, and on Friday night we did kirtan, and I didn't take care of my voice hollering to Krishna, so I'll be a little hoarse. So let me know if you can't hear me, or if I should enunciate, and I'll repeat myself. I've been thinking lately, as I often do, maybe in the last few years of my practice, thinking a lot about suffering. And so now you might think, oh no, another talk on suffering. Why am I not at the Bluegrass Festival? But of course, all those old songs, they're all about suffering. You know. My lover left me. The car broke down. The government took my land. I got a broken heart. So maybe we're all doing the same teaching. We all get together and we are honest about what happens in our life. Maybe a year ago I came and talked, I think, also about suffering. Not last time in May when I talked about sex. If you missed that one, you might be like, oh, geez. Let's do sex again. Terry talked about the Four Noble Truths, this foundational Buddhist teaching. And its core, and I'm not going to go talk on the Four Noble Truths today. Is anyone here totally unfamiliar with them? Never heard of those Four Truths? Great. So we have some common language. But I'll start with a little story. And I'll tell just a piece of this story. This is a very, very ancient story from the Indian traditions. It's the story that appears in an early text called the Katha Upanishad. And the Upanishad means whispered teachings. So I could whisper it to you. It's my broken voice today. They were early writings coming out of the Vedic tradition. This text was written down about 3,000 years ago. And it was oral tradition before that, so we don't really know. This is a very old story. I'll tell little bits of it. And it touches into the topic. And I really love this story because it's about a young man. It's about a man who has a relationship with his father. And it's about a man who has a relationship with death. And each of those things is both personally moving to me in my life and feels important on our path. So, in the beginning of the story, there's a household, there's a family, and the father of the family is a kind of traditionally observant religious layperson of that time. So he's making offerings to the priests who will do the fire ceremony. And the primary spiritual practice of that time was making offerings into the fire. And so giving milk and fuel and money and meat, animals, to pray as a way of praying. Very, very ancient primal practice. And this text, the Katha, is actually the beginning of a turning away from that practice in Indian history, and as we'll see, begins a trend that the Buddha then takes up some years later, and we are still engaging in today, which is the trend toward internalization of this fire sacrifice, this ceremony or ritual. So I'll say something about that. It's not the main point, but maybe it'll come back. So this father is making donations to the priests, and he gets in an argument with his son over what the right amount of donation is. They're kind of saying, like, yeah, I know how to do it right. And the other one's like, no, you're not doing it right. This is the way to do it. And it's like, I know how to do it right. I'm the father, And the son is like, you're not doing it right. And, and they get into it. And I get this. I didn't have the easiest time with my father. I don't. Currently, I have an easier time than ever before. But it's not heaven yet. I'm not holding my breath. But it's changed a lot, and maybe I'll say something about that as well. It's another thread of this story. So they get in an argument, and the father basically loses his temper and says, "Look, if you think I'm not doing this right, you think I'm not giving the right offering, like, what do you want me to give? Like, you want me to, like, what? Why don't I just give you? Huh? Like, go to hell. Basically." And the son's name is Nachiketa. And Nachiketa says, "I'll show you." And he leaves. And he travels for a long time, mythical time. He goes to the end of the earth, and he goes to the realm of the king of death. So he goes to hell. There's not really a hell in this story, like fire and brimstone. It's more like a place where the being who governs dying lives. As he goes to the home of the king of death, whose name is Yama in these stories. And I find this very funny in this story, but when he gets there, death is not there. He's out collecting the rent. Now, as someone who's rented in the city for 20 years, I have an opinion about this, and landlords, but death is out collecting the rent. And I think we also know what that means. Death is out doing his business, collecting what is owed him. And so Nachiketa waits, and this waiting is really important. He sits and waits. And because death is out, because the host of the house is out, he's not fed or given any hospitality. He just waits. And he waits for 3 days. And of course this is a myth. So 3 days is a magical number, and it's a very long time to wait for your host to arrive. When death comes back from his rounds, Nachiketa is there, and death immediately says, "Who are you? That nobody comes to visit me. I'm the king of death." And Nachiketa says, "I've come because I want something." And death says, "Well, I've kept you waiting, and that's rude. That's not right for a host to keep a guest waiting, and you've waited with patience and fortitude for these 3 days. So for each of those days you've waited, I will give you a boon." Boon is the old Victorian translation. We could almost say death is like the genie. He says, "Okay, you get 3 wishes now." And so the first step in this story is that the young man, out of the heat of the moment with his father and out of the heart of that suffering, needed something different and went where he thought he could find the source of that transformation for himself. And then the second thing he had to do was wait. And wait, to me, means practice. It means before you could even see the teacher or meet the source of what would save him or transform him or offer him a method to transform himself, he had to practice. And after I graduated college, a very sarcastic, ironic art school, I came back to San Francisco, my home area, got a little job as a file clerk in an accounting firm. Really boring. And I lived, on a piece of foam in a dingy flat on Oak Street with a couple of friends from art school. And we played a lot of gin rummy, and we didn't have any money. And it wasn't that great. And I left. I took my little bit of earnings, I bought some gear, I bought a backpack and some stuff, and I set out to hitchhike to New York. And I did. And I traveled across the country, and I played my violin on street corners for spare change, and I got long rides with truckers across the wilds of Canada and the Midwest. And I got a ride with some Nazis in Nebraska who one driver turned around, looked at me, no pupils in his eyes at all. He said, "Do you want some speed?" I was like, "Do you want me to drive?" Yeah, it's not going to be a story like, deliverance. But it could have gone worse ways than it did. I didn't know where I was going. I hitchhiked back and forth across the country, and I ended up at a Zen monastery in the mountains of New Mexico, because I had heard somewhere that this Zen thing was interesting, I don't know where I even heard it the first time. I wish I could remember. I think I had come across it in my beginner's mind or something. And I also was artistic. And I really liked the crisp clarity of the Zen thing. Like everyone wears black and you sit in a row and it's this beautiful Japanese architecture and you drink tea like this. And I was like, structure. That's cool. And I landed there and I sat there and nobody gave me any instructions. Because they weren't like that in that Zen school. They were like, sit up straight and don't fall asleep. I failed at both. I still fail at both. From time to time. But they didn't say anything about what to do or how to do it. So I sat there and I waited. And something in me kind of liked it and I waited for several months there. Practicing, getting up early. So death offers Nachiketa 3 wishes. Because he had made him wait. And the first wish Nachiketa asks for is, he says, all right, I ask that my father treat me as I was before. So he basically asks for forgiveness first. He says, may my father, may the rift or the dis-ease between my father and I be healed. And he adds in it, may it be healed and may I go home alive from here. It's a good thing to add in when you're talking to the king of death. Mm-hmm. And when I read the story, I was like, wait, is that 2 wishes? Did he like sneak in? But, death isn't splitting hairs. Death is like, okay, you got it. You go home alive and your father will treat you as you were before. You will be in his good graces. So I want to talk a little about forgiveness. When we're practicing, when we come to sit, and something brings us here to sit, and for me it was suffering. Was anyone brought to practice not through suffering? Great, that's easier than having everyone raise their hands. Because it's so much the doorway in for so many of us. I don't know how it occurred to me that sitting still would be a remedy for misery. Because I don't know how I got to that, but when I started, sitting still was miserable, so it didn't feel like a remedy at all. But I stuck with it. And so one of the things that happens, and I'm sure that we're all familiar with this, you've all been sitting, some of you are very experienced students, and very experienced humans in this world, that when we sit still, when we get a little quiet, what comes is the story of the past, is the story of my failings, and the failings of people around me, and the situation that was really hard, or impossible. When I realized on some retreat, maybe years into my practice, how much of the time I spent sitting here rewriting the movie of the past and saying the right thing, doing the right thing, slipping out of trouble when actually I didn't, in reality, slip out. When I realized how much time I spent doing that, really sobering. Like, wow, I'm just sitting here. I'm sitting here and going, okay, if, just fill in the blank, it doesn't matter what the story is, right? If it had been different, boy, would things be better now. I would be way further along this enlightenment thing than I am. And there'd be way fewer people mad at me in this world. So I love that this is the first thing that Nachiketa asks for. I think it's a really intelligent thing to ask for. I'm not sure as a young man if I would have asked for that. I'm not sure it would have occurred to me to ask for that. I might have been like, okay, big blessing. I want to have like the power in my heart to go all the way. Like, I would have asked for something macho, right? I want to be an enlightened man. And Nachiketa gets to that one, but he gets to it later. The first thing he asks for is very realistic, and it's grounded because we don't get enlightened in some other place. He doesn't say, oh, can I stay here in your house, death, away from the world and all this mess, and away from my father? Can I go onto a mountaintop or into some heaven realm and become enlightened there and be finished? He says, the first thing I'm going to do is go back home. And so in order to live at home in any harmony at all, my relations have to be healed. So he asks for that first. So when we sit, it's so common for the story of the past to come up. And then so often, why do I remember the negative things more than the positive things? I've had a great life. I've had a lot of fun. And love. And beautiful people. But I remember the disasters. So then there's this hindrance of regret. One of the things that has been really useful for me in relation to this habit has been to reflect on the difference, or to feel into the difference between regret and remorse. So, and I kind of want to make this a little more of a discussion. So, maybe it's because I'm in grad school and I'm having these discussions with people. But what's the difference between regret and remorse? For you, for anyone. How do you feel those two things? Yeah.
I'll make a stab at it. I think regret is just wishing things were different than they had been. Remorse is wishing you behaved better than you had.
Yeah. Right. So the remorse takes it in.
Regret is more.
Yeah.
Well, that's my answer.
Totally. So the difference between wishing that things were different than they had been and wishing that I had behaved differently. And the other reflections, regret and remorse, how are they different?
Remorse to me feels like it comes from the heart.
Yeah.
Regret comes from the brain.
Yeah, right, heart and brain. Totally. What would it mean for it to come from the heart? What does that feel like?
Well, I can even feel it right now in my heart at the moment, and I'm not even really focusing on any one thing.
Yeah.
But that's just the embodiment of it. In my own body, I feel it here. It's just something like a sadness, or, it isn't even an embarrassment. Why did I go? It's like, how could I cause someone else pain?
Yeah.
So it's connected to also compassion.
Yeah. And I think this is key. Does one more person want to say anything about that in your experience, regret or remorse? Yes.
Remorse for me has a component of taking responsibility for your past actions and making a commitment concerning future actions.
Yeah, great. Taking responsibility and commitment, and it's really different than just sitting here thinking about that past thing, whatever it was. And I think this is also in that kind of brain, heart distinction. On the contemplative path, remorse turns out to be really useful. Regret turns out to be almost not useful at all. And they're close, but they're not the same thing, as each of these reflections is pointing to. At the heart of the path, both in the Buddhist and yogic tradition, is concentration. Is what we do when we sit down, when we assemble the mind, we assemble the attention. We bring ourselves to stability. or toward stability. And concentration is difficult, right? The mind wanders, it goes. Why is it so difficult? Like, what's all that wandering? Right? For me, I realized that a good lion's share of that wandering was regret about the past, and most of the rest was planning how I was going to do it perfectly from now on and be a brilliant success without a single failure from this moment on. It's all future. So, and I think that's different from that commitment to do well. A commitment is like a heart quality. Fantasizing about the perfect house with Japanese architecture that I would build because I was going to be so successful at being enlightened is not a commitment to behave well in the world. That's just grasping at future. So it turns out to be deeply supportive of serenity and peace to deal with the habit of regret and the habit of fantasy. So I started off thinking about coming here, thinking about this particular teaching in the Buddhist tradition that has sort of a lofty name, but it's called transcendent dependent origination, and it's weighty. So I'm only going to touch on it. If you get very excited about it, I'm doing a 5-week class on dependent origination. You can come. You get as much thick Buddhist metaphysics as you want. There's a cycle that's talked about in the Dharma teachings called dependent origination. It basically describes how suffering arises out of cause and effect. So how we get into trouble, basically. And it can be a bit of a downer at first go. And again, I'm not going to give a full teaching on it. It goes something like this. From primal ignorance arises karmic formations. From karmic formations arises consciousness and mind and body. And from all that, there's senses. And from your senses, there's contact with things in the world. And then you grasp. Or from contact, there's the feeling of liking and disliking. And then you grasp. And then you cling. And then you get calcified in an identity. And then there's birth and death, the round of reincarnation over and over and over again. And boom, you're back at primal ignorance. And it goes around and around. This is one of the core things the Buddha taught. And, when you first hear it, you're like, oh, I'm done for. Because this is constantly happening, right? Sense contact. I see something, I kind of like it. You see your eyes, your beautiful eyes. I like them, and then I might think, oh, I want him to keep looking at me. That's grasping, right? And like, what if we became friends? Then he'd look at me a lot, right? And then I'm clinging. And then I'm like, what if we were like the great teacher-student pair, and I've become this sort of ridiculous identity. And then the pleasure of the eyes is gone, right? So that happens all the time. And it hurts. And it happens with pleasurable things and painful things. So the Buddha gave this teaching. It occurs only a couple times in the whole volume of the teachings. It's this tiny little scripture. But it's very cool. And it talks about the round of dependent origination, and he says, but there's this other way off. And he said there's a different 12 links called transcendent dependent origination, where it starts at the last link of the chain, the birth and death link, and calls it suffering. And it says that it's not always the case that suffering, it just leads to ignorance and more hurtling around that round of sorrow. It says suffering, and this is all about, dependent origination is all about causative conditions. Like the condition of the sense contact of the eyes leads to the experience of liking and disliking, of pleasurable and unpleasurable. So it's about how each thing leads to the next, and how our experience is driven by the momentum of that one thing leading to the next. So the transcendent chain says, oh, there's a way off. Suffering can also lead to faith. And so it leaps out of this cycle of destructive experiences, and it says, suffering can also lead to faith. And when it does, faith leads to joy. And joy leads to contentment and ease and bliss and clear seeing. And it goes through this whole list of beautiful qualities up to full liberation. And the reason I like to mention it, and even just to mention it a tiny bit right now, is that it's really encouraging to hear this foundational teaching that suffering can lead to freedom. And in a way, it's this version of the 12 links, this version of dependent origination, that reminds me the most of the 12 steps. And a few of you might have experience with those. I don't have a lot of experience with them, but I know them a little bit, and they're beautiful. And in a similar way, it starts with a recognition of suffering, and it goes to a very deep freedom. And it proceeds, by the way, through a very full practice of forgiveness. Right? The whole middle part of the 12 steps practice is forgiveness practice in these various ways of making amends and taking inventory, forgiving myself, forgiving others, asking for forgiveness. So suffering gives rise to faith. And I think that's part of how many of us come to practice. It's part of how I came to practice. I was miserable. I found this Zen practice. I had no idea what I was doing, but I sat there for a while. And after some years of that, I realized that I still didn't really know what I was doing, and I was still mostly miserable, but there was some way to anchor myself or guide myself in the world. And this is the faith piece. I actually had begun to feel or believe that this Buddhist practice could lead me to a deeper freedom, a deeper happiness. I started to get a sense, I smelled it. My Zen teacher turns 104 this year. I haven't seen him in about a decade, but he's still alive. He's the oldest living Japanese Zen teacher, possibly in the world, and certainly in the West. He's fierce. Talk about a father figure. And I needed a really fierce practice at that time in my life. It was hard as hell. So Nachiketa asks for forgiveness from his father and is granted that. When I think about how he was granted forgiveness, I don't imagine that death said, okay, like magic wand, fairy godmother, and changed the father's mind magically. So that when Nachiketa came home, it would just be like prodigal son. The father would be like, you're back, my son. I actually imagine that what happened is what death gave to Nachiketa was the inner strength to be able to go back to his father and ask for that forgiveness and do the work. And again, a little personal story. A good decade after I started that Zen practice, I had found my way to Theravada practice, Thai forest practice up at Spirit Rock with Jack Kornfield and those folks. And I had really fallen in love with that practice. It moved me in a soft and beautiful way that Zen hadn't. And somebody finally told me what to do while I was meditating, which was very useful. 6 years of Zen, no instructions. Finally, I was like, the first time somebody said, when your mind wanders, bring it back, I was like, dope. Nobody said that before. I was just sitting there thinking about shit for years, designing houses and, redoing bad first dates from when I was 16. And nobody ever said, bring your mind back to the breath or the body. And then and then for a moment I thought I'd wasted 6 years. But I hadn't, because when they said do it, I was like, oh, and I could do it. So training is good for something. So about 10 years after I started Zen, I got so into the Theravadan practice that I went to Burma, and I was a monk there for a rains retreat for about 4 months with the teacher there, sitting, doing pretty strict Vipassana. And I got a fax there, which is like, oh my God, I've become a monk. I'm in Burma. I'm in this like closed, repressive, fascistic government on the other side of the world, deep in a rainforest in Southeast Asia. There's not even really a phone, but there kind of is a phone. And I get a fax from California. And I'm like, man, you just can't run away anymore. Like, where do you go? Where are you going to go? Dude becomes a monk in Burma, and they can still... It's a fax from my father. And it says, your mother has a week to live, come home. And the monks aren't that sensitive, I was just given the fax wordlessly while I was in walking meditation. They didn't say, like, stop your walking meditation and come to the office. They just walked into the hall. I was walking back and forth very slowly, concentrating on lifting, moving, and placing. And they're just like... And my retreat was over. No integration period. Within a day, I was back in layperson's clothes, buying Buddhist tchotchkes at the market, waiting for my airplane. And I was home. And I was hanging out with my mother as she was dying of cancer for a week. I was there for about the last 10 days of her life. I'm glad I made it back. I'm glad the fax came. And I was sitting there with her. And, we had a really rough time, me and my mom. I said some really mean things. She said some really mean things. She wasn't the most enlightened mother, and I was a real shit. And I was sitting there, and I didn't know what to say. And the thought came to me. It was like, you've been practicing the Dharma for 10 years. Like, what have you learned in all that time? I was like, oh. And I asked for forgiveness for what had happened. And it was hard to do it. Like, I didn't want to. Lots of years of sitting on my own and being like, yes, may you be well, may you be happy. Easy. Sitting there with her and actually being embarrassed to ask for forgiveness because I hate admitting that I've ever done anything wrong. And I made myself do it. Like, some part of me, some Dharma teacher inside was like, this is the right thing to do. Like, and this is the moment. Like, there's no other moment for this. And I did it. And she was great. She said, oh, I know. Me too. I said, yeah, I know. And I'm so glad that happened. And maybe, if I could fix the past, it would have happened 20 years before. But it didn't. It happened just in the right moment. And then she's gone. So, it's so important to heal the heart and the past if we're going to be able to sit down and do our practice. And one of the sort of smart aleck lines that gets passed around Dharma circles around regret is that an aspect of freedom is giving up all hope of a better past. And I've had to give it up so many times. I'm like, oh, if things had been better, man. But give it up. So, enough on that. It's good. You get it. I think a lot of us get it really deeply. This is important and strongly felt. So, Nachiketa has the power, is given the power to ask for forgiveness, and he knows that it will happen. And the second thing that he asks for, he says, okay, second Buddha. He asks for the inner fire. He asks for will. He asks for the power and the fortitude to walk the path. And so that's now what we're all doing. And at various times we lose our inner fire and we get lost. It's totally fine to get lost on the path. We could get a big picture and say that there's nothing that's not the path because karma unfolds the way it must. My teacher Sylvia loves to say, with this kind of enlightened grandmother smile, she says, it couldn't be otherwise. Nothing could be otherwise. And so in relation to this regret, this is incredible. Karma, and again, not a talk on karma. Karma says everything happens for a reason, and often lots of reasons. And so whatever's happening right now is happening this way because of all the conditions that have led to this moment. So I'm here conditioned by my years of practice. You're here conditioned by your years of practice. This space is conditioned by years of practice, as well as all of us being conditioned by 2,500 years of practice started by the Buddha, and his practice was conditioned by a practice that was written down before he was born by the folks who wrote the story of Nachiketa, and their practice was conditioned by the fire ceremony, and on back to the beginning of the beginning. Karma says that our conditions are based on our own actions, so when we act well, we're more likely to receive the results of acting well, which is wellness. It said, but they're also conditioned by the actions of everything else. So I bear the karma of my family, and of my country, and of my race, and my tribe, and my friends, and my people, all of that. So, I'm curious for anyone that might share, maybe for a couple people to share, anything about how suffering, stress, sorrow led you to practice or led you toward faith, however you define faith. I think this is such a beautiful turn, this thing that's just true, that suffering can lead to more suffering, and it does that a lot, but it also can lead toward faith, toward practice, and toward this domino effect of all the good qualities leading to deep freedom. And that has happened for all of us because we wouldn't be here sitting together listening to some guy talk about suffering and his mom rather than being at the Castro Street Fair or out at the Bluegrass Festival. So this is true for everyone here, that suffering has led to some kind of faith, some kind of upwelling in the heart that says like, oh, there's a way. So I'd love to hear a couple little examples of that, and for each other to hear, because this is so universal. Please.
So my story, which I will try to keep brief, is how suffering led to practice and not to faith.
Yes.
Which I think is, for me, is anti-Buddhist. And just to keep it short, I came to Buddhism during caring for my mother during her final weeks by a somewhat accidental path, and discovered that it helped my multi-decades of insomnia problems. And it was that relatively immediate, though not by any means complete, benefit that led me onto the path, which eventually led to GBF 15 years ago and to Buddhism.
When you say it helps insomnia, what was the it? Was it sitting practice, like meditation?
It
what?
was, I guess the term, I wouldn't have known the term now, but it was contemplative practice, reading Stephen Levine very slowly and reflectively.
Oh, wonderful. And
doing some guided meditations. It did not lead, however, and has not led to faith, which, just a word, of course, suggests stopping questioning.
Uh-huh.
And for me, one of the fundamental aspects of Buddhism is that it is, if you like, empirical and experimental.
Yes.
And it's about what is working rather than this is the true way and all of you better follow it too or I'll kill you.
Absolutely. There's not that much of the or I'll kill you in the Buddhist tradition in history, which I'm very happy about, having grown up as a Catholic. What's your name?
Lee.
Lee, thank you so much. Yeah. And maybe that's a nice point to address. What's our timing? How long do we go?
We should probably wrap it up.
Well, we should. It's always like that. Faith in the Buddhist teachings is, I think what Lee says is right about the Buddhist practice being very empirical and not top down in a you must believe kind of way. When the Buddha talks about really entering the stream of practice, and I imagine many of you are familiar with this, the words used are to take refuge. We take refuge in Buddha, we take refuge in the Dharma and the teachings, we take refuge. I like the translation, we go for refuge. I go for refuge to the Sangha, to the community. I go for refuge to the Buddha. So here's a little kind of contemplative question. In relation to faith, what's the difference between faith, in that kind of believing something, and refuge? I don't know what I believe about the Buddha, but it's really useful for me to give my life to it. And when I read the list, suffering gives rise to faith, that's what it gave rise to in me. I didn't believe somehow that something was true. It's not completely true. There's things I believe, definitely. But what it really gave rise to was confidence. And the word faith, actually, in the text, the word saddha, or in Sanskrit, shraddha, it's often translated as determination or commitment, rather than faith. And that word is a little charged, so that might not be the right word for you. But faith leads to a knowing that this path goes somewhere. That's where it goes for me. So, in short, to wrap up, here's the list, just so you know where you're going. Suffering leads to faith. Faith leads to joy. Joy leads to rapture and bliss. Bliss leads to tranquility, which leads to happiness, which leads to concentration or unification of mind. Concentration leads to knowing and seeing clearly things as they are. Seeing clearly leads to disenchantment, not being fooled by things. Disenchantment leads to dispassion, not being bound up by things that aren't going to serve you. Dispassion leads to freedom. And freedom leads to knowing that you're free. So, Nachiketa is given forgiveness, the blessing of ease in the heart. He's given the inner strength to walk the path which is difficult. And for the third wish, he asks death for the secret to that which is beyond death. He basically says to death, tell me how to escape you. And death says, I can't. Well, of course, it's a myth. So the first thing death says, this shows up in every culture, right? Death says, don't ask that. How about being a great king? How about having lots of girls? How about wealth? I'll give you all that stuff, man. And now Chiketa, like Jesus, like the Buddha, like everyone who goes that test in the myths, and passes it, he says, no. I want the real goods. And finally death says, okay, and gives him a mirror. Just look at yourself. Everything you want to know is right there. So he teaches him the path of reflection, of yoga, of contemplation, of meditation. And he doesn't give him enlightenment, because you can't be given that. But he gives him the practice. So my wish is that we all find a deep forgiveness for ourselves and with the people around us, so that our hearts can be at ease, blissful, happy, tranquil. That concentration and steadiness of heart and mind may arise, and that we have the inner fire to walk the path as long as it takes. And that we are given the teachings that lead us all the way to seeing clearly and knowing that we're free. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you.
Will you be here to stay with us for a little bit?
I'll be here to say hi to folks. You can come up and ask questions. I always want to have a longer discussion at the end of these things. It's a short period. So I'm really happy when folks come up and have reflections on the conversation, anything to share. It's really lovely. My cards are out on the table somewhere. Baruch put them out. They have beautiful Saraswati on the front. It has a list of all the things that I'm doing, including 2 different 5-week class series this fall. One of them is on dependent origination through SF Insight, and a week-long retreat that I'm co-teaching up at Spirit Rock, starting in just about a week, but there's a couple of spaces left. If you want to drop your whole agenda and come up to Spirit Rock and hang out with me and do metta practice. It's going to be a retreat focusing on heart practices and yoga and devotion.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Really, every time. So, thank you.
So time for announcements, and usually for announcements I always begin with our host, which I don't think we have a host today. So one of our angels decided to go ahead and do the hot water for tea. So a little different kind of suffering. There's no goodies to go with. But we'll have some time to spend a little more time together.
But have faith, there will be next week.
Thank you. Any announcements? Jerry.
Hi. Again, thanks, Sean, for coming today. And next week, our speaker is Shahara Godfrey.
I think I should announce the LGBT annual retreat at Spirit Rock is coming up again. It's a 6-night silent retreat, starting on December 13th and going through the 19th, Monday through Sunday. And many of us have done it over the years, and it's quite a wonderful, deepening experience. About 85 people, and it's taught by LGBT teachers, Arena Weissman and Larry Yang, and Pasquale, I don't remember his last name, from Canada this year is going to be the third teacher. And so spiritrock.org is the website where you can get information. It's on a sliding scale. It's anybody want to know more about it, you can ask me. This has been going for quite a few years.
Great. Thank you. I actually have a quick announcement. There is in our latest newsletter, which there are copies outside, and you can also find it online at gaybuddhist.org. Bill Weber, who's a member of our Sangha, is presenting his latest documentary, We Were Here, which was, they had a sneak preview of it at the 2010 Frameline Festival, and it recounts the stories of men and women who lived through the years of the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco. George Hubbard, who also does all of our audio here in the Sangha, works for Meyer Sound Laboratories, and they're going to have a special screening of that on October 17th. So all members of the Sangha are invited to come. It's on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. And I am the contact. My email is there. I'm already registering people, and I have a list going. So if you don't have any plans for that night, it is once again October the 17th at 7 p.m. It's in Berkeley. All the information is there. And I highly urge you to come if you can make it. It should be a really wonderful experience.
That's great.
Oh, as well, yes.
And they're saving 46.
Yes, and I've got only about 7 or 8 so far have signed up, so there is still space. If you'd like to come, please do. Okay? That's it, I think. Let's go ahead and stand in the circle for our dedication. Will you do us the honor of sharing our dedication? Sure. Thank you.
By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, and live believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.